At exactly 0214 AM, on a bone-chilling night over the eastern desert of Deir ez-Zor, the silence of the Syrian panhandle was shattered by a sound that didn't exist in the local military manual. A formation of Russian-made Su-24s operated by Syrian loyalists began a steep, aggressive dive from 2,500 feet, screaming toward a remote U.S. outpost at over 500 miles per hour. No radio contact, no identification squawk, no warning. To the pilots in the cockpits, the base below appeared dark, silent, and utterly defenseless, a soft target for a quick propaganda victory. They believed they were ghosting through the radar gaps of a distracted superpower, but their bravado was born of a fatal ignorance. As they crossed the final engagement line, they weren't diving into an easy win. They were flying directly into the teeth of the most sophisticated air defense net ever deployed in a combat zone. The trap was set, and the Syrian air crews were about to learn that in modern warfare, the most dangerous enemy is the one that lets you think you've already won. The target of this provocation wasn't just a patch of sand. It was the invisible perimeter of a $13 billion masterpiece of kinetic power, the USS Gerald R. Ford. To the Syrian planners in Damascus, the Ford is a floating airport, but to the Pentagon, it is 1,000,000 tons of sovereign American territory that processes more tactical data in 60 seconds than the entire Syrian military handles in a month. Driven by twin A-1B nuclear reactors capable of powering a mid-sized city for 25 years, without refueling, this ship doesn't just participate in the battle, it dictates the physics of the environment. With a flight deck spanning 4.5 acres and an electromagnetic aircraft launch system, EMALS, that can hurl a 60,000-pound fighter into the sky every 45 seconds, the Overmatch is so absolute it borders on the insulting. The Su-24s, aging Soviet relics held together by hope and black market parts, were diving toward a system that tracks over 1,000 targets simultaneously, while its crew enjoys fresh Starbucks in the galley. This is why Americans don't have free healthcare, because the Ford class exists to ensure that whenever a rogue regime tries to poke the bear, they realize too late that the bear has a trillion-dollar nervous system. First contact occurred at exactly 147 nautical miles. Long before the Syrian pilots even toggled their weapon switches, they were already owned by the ANSPY-6 V1 air and missile defense radar. This isn't the rotating dish technology of the Cold War. It's an active electronically scanned array, AESA, composed of 37 radar modular assemblies, or RMAs. Each RMA is an individual radar in its own right, and when combined, they produce a sensitivity 30 times greater than the previous generation. The SPY-6 doesn't just see a blip on a screen, it sees the specific turbine blade count of an engine. It can differentiate between a stray flock of seagulls and a subsonic cruise missile at ranges exceeding 200 miles, even in the middle of a digital hurricane of electronic jamming. This system effectively dismantled the Syrian tactic in 3 distinct ways. First, its digital beamforming capability allowed it to maintain a lock on the Su-24s, while simultaneously scanning the rest of the horizon for a secondary strike. Second, it eliminated the horizon clutter that usually allows low-flying aircraft to sneak in, painting the Syrian jets against the water with surgical clarity. Third, it turned the Su-24's own radar emissions into a homing beacon. By the time the Syrians reached their 50-mile attack mark, the Ford system had already built a high-fidelity 3D profile of their flight path. The surprise the Syrians were counting on had evaporated before they even cleared the coastline. In the digital eyes of the SPY-6, these weren't lethal intruders, they were just slow-moving data points waiting to be deleted. Deep inside the hull, the Combat Direction Center (CDC) is bathed in a dim, spectral blue light. While the flight deck above is a whirlwind of jet exhaust and salt spray, the atmosphere here is eerily clinical. Operators sit hunched over high-definition consoles, their faces illuminated by the steady glow of the Aegis weapon system. There is no shouting, no frantic scrambling, and absolutely no panic. In the U.S., Navy threat response isn't an emotional reaction. It's a pre-programmed industrial process. At 0216 AM, a tactical information coordinator calmly assigns the hostile tag to the 3 approaching blips. Within 45 seconds, that data is shared across the entire strike group, from the escorting destroyers to the E-2D Hawkeye circling overhead. The air warfare officer has enough time to verify the engagement rules, check the fuel status of the cap, and even take a sip of lukewarm coffee. To the Syrians, this is the most terrifying moment of their lives. To the Americans in the CDC, it's just Tuesday. The machine has already decided the outcome. The humans are just there to witness the execution. 0217 AM. The choreography of power. The air boss in the primary flight control tower doesn't need to raise his voice. He utters 2 words over the net: launch alert. On the flight deck, the silence is annihilated. This is where the Ford's $3 billion EMALS technology justifies every cent of its development. Unlike traditional steam catapults that take minutes to reset and struggle with varying aircraft weights, EMALS uses a massive surge of electromagnetic energy to accelerate a 30-ton F/A-18 Super Hornet to 170 AAT mph in under 300 feet. The reset time is measured in seconds, not minutes. Yellow-shirted handlers move with a synchronized lethality that looks more like a ballet than a military operation. Viper 1 and Viper 2 are hooked into the shuttles. In less than 2 seconds, the pilots are slammed into their seats by 4 Gs of raw acceleration, disappearing into the pitch-black Atlantic night. Their mission is clear: intercept, identify, and shadow. Under the rules of engagement ROE, they won't fire first, but they will ensure the Syrian pilots feel the overwhelming weight of American presence. 0221A. The coordinated provocation. The radar screens in the CDC suddenly flicker with new activity. 3 more Su-24s emerge from the Syrian coast, flying low to the water to exploit the curvature of the Earth. It is a coordinated provocation, a classic poke-the-bear tactic designed to test the strike group's task saturation. In Damascus, commanders believe they are overwhelming the Ford's sensors. They are wrong. The SPY-6 radar simply partitions its processing power, tracking all 6 targets with the same high-resolution fidelity it used for the first 3. The Americans don't flinch, they simply expand the bubble. 0224 AM. The visual confirmation Viper 1 closes the gap at Mach 1.4, coming up on the wing of the lead Syrian Su-24. Through the digital joint helmet-mounted cueing system, the American pilot sees everything. He notes the faded Syrian Air Force roundels and the fact that the Su-24 is carrying external fuel tanks, but no active air-to-air missiles on its outer pylons. This is a plausible deniability flight the Syrians are trying to create an incident they can blame on navigational errors later. It's the same gray zone tactic used by Russia in the Black Sea and China in the Spratlys. The American pilot performs a slow, deliberate roll, showing the Syrian the full rack of AIM, 120 AMRAAMs tucked under his wing. The message is silent but deafening: I see you, I have you, and you are outclassed. 0239 AM. 47 minutes of aerial chess. For the next 47 minutes, the airspace becomes a theater of the absurd. The Syrian pilots, perhaps emboldened by their ground controllers, begin a series of grey zone maneuvers. They perform diving passes toward the Ford's outer picket line, pulling up at the last possible second. They drop to 800 feet, attempting to hide in the sea spray, then climb vertically to 3,000 feet in a desperate attempt to trigger a lock from the Americans. The Americans respond with a terrifying indifference. They shadow without crowding, they track without locking. They are learning the Syrian flight patterns, recording the electronic signatures of their aging radars, and building a library of data that will be used for years to come. The Syrians aren't conducting a strike. They are unknowingly participating in a USA intelligence gathering exercise. 0251 AM. The R2D2 moment. The tension hits a breaking point when one Syrian pilot, either through panic or a final act of bravado, breaks formation and dives directly toward the Ford's bow. He drops to 600 feet, screaming toward the ship's island. In an instant, the Mk-15 Phalanx CIWS, the close-in weapons system, comes to life. Nicknamed R2D2 for its white dome, the Phalanx is a 20mm Gatling gun capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute. It doesn't need a human to aim. Its internal radar calculates the lead, the wind, and the trajectory in milliseconds. The gun follows the Su-24 with a robotic, predatory twitch. The Syrian pilot flies close enough to vibrate the coffee cups in the Ford's wardroom, crossing a thin line that nearly cost him his life. Then, as suddenly as it began, the Syrian formation breaks away. They turn back toward the coast, their fuel alarms likely screaming. They leave without a word, retreating into the dawn, having accomplished nothing but their own humiliation. As the Syrian Su-24s banked hard toward the coastline, the USS Gerald R did something that stung worse than a missile lock. It did absolutely nothing. The ship maintained its exact course, 0 degrees of deviation, 0 knots of speed change. This strategic indifference is a calculated psychological weapon. By refusing to even alter its heading, the US Navy sent a clear, humiliating message to Damascus: you are not a threat, you are a nuisance. While the Syrian pilots were likely sweating through their flight suits, exhilarated by their daring flyby, the Americans were busy reaping the real harvest of the encounter. The Ford's electronic warfare suites had spent the last 47 minutes vacuuming the sky. Every time a Syrian pilot toggled his radio, every time a ground-based radar in Latakia tried to paint the strike group, and every time the Su-24s engaged their primitive fire control systems, the Americans logged it. The SPY-6 and the EA-18G Growlers captured the unique fingerprints of Syria's entire integrated air defense network. We're talking about specific pulse repetition frequencies and radar emission patterns that are worth more to the Pentagon than 100 downed jets. Damascus came looking for a reaction. Instead, they inadvertently noped their own secret frequencies into a USS database. By the time the Syrian jets touched down, the Ford had already built a high-fidelity threat profile that ensured any future real-world conflict would be over in minutes. The Syrians thought they were testing the Ford's defenses, but in reality, they were just providing free laboratory data for the most advanced military machine on the planet. The final balance sheet of this 47-minute encounter is a study in lopsided economics. For the Syrian Air Force, the cost was roughly $47, 0 inches fuel and airframe maintenance, a significant blow to a budget-starved military. But the invisible cost was catastrophic. They traded the electronic signatures of their frontline jets, worth millions in strategic secrecy, for zero tactical gain. They secured no territorial concessions and forced no change in American posture. Meanwhile, the US Navy leveraged a few $100s worth of coffee and jet fuel to bait an adversary into revealing their entire tactical playbook. It was a total strategic deficit for Damascus, proving once again that loud provocations usually yield a 0% return on investment. Less than 48 hours after the encounter, Syrian state media began broadcasting grainy zoomed-in footage of the Su-24s flying past the Ford's island. The headline in Damascus was a desperate attempt at a victory lap. Syrian Eagles force American carrier to retreat. It was a classic piece of propaganda designed for a domestic audience that would never see the full picture, but the Pentagon didn't bother with a formal protest. Instead, they simply released the Ford's internal navigation logs alongside the E-2D's wide-angle sensor data. The logs showed the 100,000-ton carrier hadn't shifted an inch from its patrol box. It was the Syrian jets that were frantically maneuvering just to stay in the air. The American response turned the heroic Syrian narrative into a global joke. In the world of gray zone confrontation, the winner isn't the one who shouts the loudest on TV, but the one whose data remains undisputed. By comparing the Syrian pilots to aggressive seagulls at a beach picnic, the U.S. Navy signaled that this wasn't a military clash, it was a toddler's tantrum. The Syrian leadership was left looking both tactically inept and diplomatically dishonest, caught in a lie by a digital record that doesn't care about feelings, only the cold, hard reality of GPS coordinates. The aftermath of this encounter reveals a fundamental truth about 21st century power. Some lessons are taught with explosions, but the most painful ones are taught with indifference. The Syrian High Command wanted to prove that the Eastern Mediterranean was a contested space, but they only succeeded in proving their own obsolescence. They came looking for a reaction, a frantic launch of missiles or a panicked retreat, and instead they got a shrug. This lack of American response is the ultimate form of psychological warfare. It reinforces the idea that the Syrian military is so far down the food chain that they don't even warrant a change in the Ford's daily routine. By exposing the gap between the loud doctored footage on Syrian television and the silent surgical precision of the Aegis logs, the UNES dismantled the only weapon the Assad regime had left: its image. The humiliation isn't just about the technology, it's about the realization that the entire Syrian air defense strategy is transparent to an American operator sitting in a climate-controlled room. Damascus didn't just lose a skirmish, they lost the ability to pretend they are a peer competitor. In the end, they provided the world with a masterclass in how to turn a military provocation into a public relations suicide note. In the final tally, the encounter over Deir ez-Zor wasn't a battle of aircraft, but a battle of realities. While one side is still fighting for headlines, the other is fighting for data. The Syrian Su-24s returned to a base that is now more vulnerable than ever, while the USS Gerald R Ford continues its patrol. Its database is filled with the electronic ghosts of its enemies. If you want to understand how the US military wins the wars of tomorrow before they even start, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell.